seems stream broke momentarily, but not lounge. It's probably fine. I'm not sure if the stream was technically ever up, but who knows. And in case therefore it wasn't, welcome to another SixyTimes Battle Lounge with the 2MK team. We are, as you can see, playing Dead or Alive. And probably because of the jitteriness with stream, whether or not we continue for more than another 45 minutes has more to do with how many people join this particular one. We're not necessarily expecting a lot since this game isn't super popular anymore. But everyone's still gotta enjoy whatever games they actually like to play, and that, for us, means DOA in the 3D gaming space. If you also enjoy this game, feel free to join in if you are anywhere in Europe, because this is the EU stream, or anywhere on the east coast of the United States. You might have a little more trouble if you are in the Caribbean or something, so even though we normally say this is an Atlantic Rim lounge, it's a little different in these cases. We've got relatively standard matchup for us today too. With punishes, chasing, zoning, all those things. So you're probably going to see a lot of adaptation, which I won't necessarily have that much to say about, as it's going to be happening so quickly that if you're not really familiar with the game, it won't make any sense to you, and if you are really familiar with the game, you're quite possibly far beyond the level where it matters, if I explain it. You may get little snippets of it here and there, but for now, you can focus on two things if you're just thinking about whether or not this game means anything. And since the matchup will continue to be this for a while, you might be able to see the nuances in it. You also might only see like 4 stages because we only like about 4 stages enough to play. Other team members have preferences for other stages, but not so much us. In this case, therefore, we have relatively large space to move around, and you'll probably note that from the Kasumi side, I'm looking to use certain max range moves because my opponent tends to move out of range as a default, given enough time. So I have to look for max range stuff and a lot of whiff punishes. This is also useful for me in another way. Because that's their tendency, whenever they do attack, it's difficult for them to get all the way in for what they need to do, and I could at least have a chance of getting what I want every time. So, the movement of my opponent, basically, you should think of it this way. They are put themselves in a position where, when they do attack, I have confidence that I can stop it. And when I'm attacking, I have a bit more control. Now, in order to make this work out in the end, the last thing I would need to do is change the rhythm at which I attack so that I don't get held. since if you can only use your longest range moves, it's kind of obvious what's going to come, and in her case it's usually either a high kick or a mid kick. I also have to do damage very slowly over time. My opponent therefore can improve their position, not necessarily by whiff punishing the max range moves, but by setting up the hold more. Using additional special advancing moves and techniques will also help because a lot of them can be continued and the continuation will beat the counter. Other than that, it's a standard with punishy game. Over time, my job would be to play slower because attacking against a person who zones you out too heavily, too fast, will just leave them in the same mental state they were in before. But at the same time, one can't afford to just not attack because this will eventually cause them to change state and come up with a technique for actually attacking. It's a mind state thing as a generality. Give your opponent just enough time to realize that it's basically not you attacking anymore, but then pick that moment so that you're ready to defeat them just as they finally decide, okay, I'm attacking now then. In games where you have reasons to stop to check your meter, that's usually a good thing to be doing in that space, to figure out what tactics are likely to be possible on either side due to meter amounts available. In DOA with 1, the simpler meter, and 2, generally less jumping and longer combos based on the meter explicitly, it doesn't come up as often because the tactics don't change as heavily. You don't have moves that become safe because they have metered versions, or combos you can extend or moves you can confirm only because you have meter. So it's a lot more about simple interactions that you're looking for to make sure are right or wrong. So right now, what you're watching is the consistent movement between a person who is watching for an attack and then preparing their own as soon as they don't think it's coming, and a person who is consistently trying to attack but also pausing to make the opponent think it's their turn. Kasumi and Ayane specifically don't have a lot of points in the match where they can mislead and entirely dodge the other, because they have such a variety of moves and attack positions that it's hard to completely get around the other one's attacks. After a while, one is usually able to work in the throw game, but not for the reason that you can work it in against most other characters. You have to convince your opponent that you definitely have advantage, and they are best served by blocking. But, for example, you notice that my opponent backs off even in parts of their moves. So for me to spend too much time on relentless attacking is generally going to lead to nothing. I do have a move that does help here, but it's not necessarily helpful until I have convinced my opponent that it is time to stop moving, which is not easy to do. In general, as the sun gets better, convincing I'm going to stop moving is too difficult. So I must use the move differently than I normally do. And I'm going to get thrown a lot for doing this. Because you'll notice that regardless of anything else, my opponent's spacing is very, very precise. Sun will not give me anything for free in the spacing department. At least not in this matchup. Similarly, changing to play Nico, for example, wouldn't necessarily make anything better, because the way that Nico interacts with people at longer range generally means that she will get held, and she doesn't have any misleading approach at the level required. It would just be relying on my opponent doesn't know how to hold every single approach move, because she generally isn't tricky about how she approaches, only whether or not she approaches. But for Kasumi, you can increase the mental stack of difficulty because she's so capable of jumping fairly high, going into the air, and has more options in that space than a lot of other characters. I don't think I'm using even half of them yet. And while Ayane can just kick her out of the air half the time, it's not as simple as I'm going to make this my goal. Even that is a max range, practically whiff punish style situation. And yes, I just wasted the entire meter to convince my opponent I was going to be very aggressive. But that is the move in question. The more I'm able to use that one effectively, the more my opponent has to spend other time thinking about whether or not a specific other move I'm doing is actually going to be a danger or is going to be a grab. Which leads to covering the space in above her head more often, and therefore making mid kicks again available, as opposed to blocking the mid kicks or holding the mid and high kicks, which is the thing I want to do. Is it over the wall, right? Yes. When you're playing a character that has a lot of different options, because they're somehow strong in one of those options, you tend to hit the wall fairly quickly. Your opponent will often find the way to beat that option, and even though it won't necessarily make the match just something you auto lose or make you a pushover, you do have to think about the fact that they're just going to keep doing their best option in that space, and they'll be thinking about how to maximize their damage, do other meter things, and so on. In this game, even so, that's still a problem. Even though the weird way combos scale in this game requires people to decide, am I actually going for more damage or not? You're not going to be able to get away from it. Unless your moves are like so safe, is the best way to put it. In this game, that usually means that the spacing after the move is hard to punish, similar to a King of Fighters game, more so than that the frame data of the move is particularly good. Your character's recovery positions and extended hurt boxes after finishing their move may matter a lot more than how much it is on block, for example. Both of these characters are really good at just bypassing the other one's hold instincts, or rather the player of the other one. They have so many different directional attacks that you can't be sure that you'll ever get it right. And worse yet, they both have decent speed for getting into throw position, so you still can't be sure how right it is. Contrast with a character like Zack, if you're familiar with the game, who has some options, but generally Zack is more relying on the fact that you are not in a position to land the hits or to get the hold, because he's already done too many things. For superhuman powers. At the moment, for example, I'm abusing the fact that my opponent's moves that take them close enough to me also advance quickly enough that if I do go for the attempted shoulder mount, let's call it that, I'm going to end up so far under and to the other side of their movement that I won't take any damage. It's too hard for Ayane to quickly chase back to Konsumi's position because she's just basically slid under her with her own attack. Otherwise, what's going to happen is that I'm going to get hit because the attack chosen will not be an advancing one. It will simply be, yes, I knew you were going to do that, I'm going to hit you now. Nico costumes. Further adaptation would probably be, there's probably got to be a point at which I stop using the super right after being break held. But if you're being extremely clear on your plans and like trying to mess with your opponent's mindsets, the question is, for example, I could have done it there again, but that was a perfect example of my situation. Not doing it there wouldn't have probably wouldn't have lost me the match. I was in a position where I didn't need to do it again. At least not for victory. And that's the perfect time to not do something of that type. Because it makes your opponent at least see for a moment that you haven't done it. But the reason you didn't do it had nothing to do with the fact that it wasn't likely to work or anything like that. It was simply, oh, I don't need it to win here. And because I don't need it to win here, I can afford to, let's call it, sacrifice the chance to do the damage. But depending on the speed of the match, your opponent might not be thinking about that as much. They might not realize that the reason you didn't do it was because you specifically chose that moment as I don't need to. Helping you because it puts back in their mindset, oh, you're not necessarily going to do that every time. And the whole not doing it every time is therefore important. If you have enough mental space to plan that sort of thing, and you're up against the sort of player that if you feel like your player is constantly predicting you, your opponent is constantly predicting you, it may be worth devoting some of your mental space to doing precisely that, to figuring out when don't I need to do this thing that I keep on doing, so that I can at least stop them from thinking I always do it. And of course, if your opponent is very strong and always constantly thinking in the same sorts of ways, there's no harm in it. There's nothing that's lost by choosing to do it then, other than that they might not actually go through that. They might decide, no, I'm definitely going to still try to do the same thing I always do. I don't really care if I get hit by this time. That would be another good situation there. If you are basically low on health, and any tap is going to hit you and kill you, you could decide, oh, I'm going to try to play neutral, but all those things end up being stressful anyway, so why not just go for pressure on wake up, for example, because you always go for pressure on wake up. Maybe convince them that you will always go for pressure on wake up, when really you're just thinking, yeah, I'm going to die anyway, I don't care. Notice what I mentioned before is somewhat playing out now. Because I will eventually do that, my opponent guards that space, and it's easier to kick them. From the calculation side, I'm definitely thinking that it's more worth my effort to do this that way. As a general strategy, it makes more sense to attack using the head, using the grab, because it also is helping in the other way I mentioned. I'm able to get around Ayane's advances more quickly by using this move, and I don't take much damage for doing it. However, Kasumi's mid-range game using the kicks is so much stronger and so much my preference that I'm paying in health to get to kick. That was a whiff punish throw, which is something you should always do in this game in case you didn't know. Throw is your go-to punish and close range whiff punish because it's among the fastest option in the game. Always. But back to the point, I want to kick. And I get to kick by letting myself take damage on a certain thing. Enough. The thing that I want to take damage from isn't terribly damaging, so it's fine. Other than that, I'm worried about all the other things I'm missing out on and getting incorrect. But those are specifically things that I'm getting incorrect. I could look at them and say, I can do this better. I understand why that missed. It isn't just a close range interaction in which it came down to frame data and it could be something as simple as lag. Chances are it was you misjudging or me misjudging the situation, but it definitely could just be lag. Even if you're not the type to plan your movements a lot in games, or you tend to fight a lot of players who override your plans, who have characters who are more effective in planning situations and yours is more effective close up, it still pays to understand why your opponent is doing what they want to do. In this case, for example, I'm generally not trying to land the shoulder mount throw in the first place, but if you could stop me from doing it every single time, it still wouldn't necessarily be a benefit. So there's no real good point to changing the way one plays to avoid that move, or even sometimes to counter it. Now, there are definitely people out there who will keep doing that sort of thing forever. As soon as they realize you have stopped countering it, they will keep doing it. But this is again partially about emotions and ways people like to play. I like to kick things. So my opponent can be reasonably sure that even though I might be able to just constantly do the shoulder mount, I don't necessarily want to. My instinct will eventually cause me to do something else just because that's how I prefer to play the game. Similarly, letting me get close is going to lead to the same things. In fact, a large amount of why we interact this way is based on the very first layer I mentioned in the matchup. My opponent instinctively somewhat slowly moves away, sometimes just bad dashing as well. But we got to the point of me wanting to use kicks, max range kicks, and those kicks being held. I needed to unlock the kicks again as an option for me to make any progress in the match. My opponent could eventually spend more time not moving away, and again, it's not really that this is just, oh, my opponent runs from me. This is just the way Ayane fights a lot of the time. So you can't necessarily avoid it altogether. But this, while damaging and resulting in a close range pressure situation, is still something that one doesn't have to care about as much because I can't necessarily spam it. I have no idea why I'm just getting this rain of Nico costumes. Presumably because I only unlock Nico. I wonder if it works like that. It shouldn't unlock costumes for characters I don't own, so there's that. One of those benefits of being cheap and not buying the whole game. I'm finally choosing randomly just so that we get different stages, but that was still not particularly great stage-wise, so maybe I shouldn't. In many cases, one can say one has reached the end of a matchup. Aside from your opponent outsmarting you with their own skill and shenanigans, there comes a point after maybe 3 to 5 interactions or ways of thinking about matchups where probably you understand what's happening enough to say, yeah, I don't need to know more than this in order to play it. And this is usually where you finally understand or can see the limitation of a specific character. But sometimes you think you've reached that point, but the other players who are much higher level than you, who have been playing that same matchup in that same way for really long, have options to tell you, no, actually you can do this too. But I don't know what it is for Ayane this time. It's optimal for her to continue to use her standard natural moves. It's relatively easy for Kasumi to do the thing I'm doing. So if there is a final step to this, I don't know it. And I'll assume that Sun will work on it because we've gotten this far, and we'll figure it out. Or someone will eventually come in and just explain it all. Now, this doesn't really apply if you play Ayane totally differently. But if you do play Ayane totally differently, it could be that my kicks just work, and you don't get the matchup doesn't go in this direction to begin with. But I'm unfortunately at advantage here. I have to be more willing to keep doing the overall shoulder mount, but other than that, I still have overall advantage tactically, conceptually, because I can now see what the next part is. I need to watch for more of Ayane's lows and hold low more often, but beyond that, we're somewhat at the point where I have control of things in the way that I want to, at least, which is really the only important way. If you have control in the way you want to have it, it doesn't really matter if your opponent is beating you or not. You shouldn't spend too much time thinking about it. Just make sure you bear in mind what exactly it is that they need to adapt past. What strategy is, which part of your strategy is it that you added as the last bit? Because that's the part that for the most part your opponent has to counter. You can loop through them in your head cleanly enough to recognize, oh, I'm getting held in neutral on these high kicks because I stopped using as much of the shoulder mount throw. I'm getting hit out of the shoulder mount throw because I got too focused on it and started doing too many high kicks. I'm getting rushed down and hit because I stopped kicking because I kept on getting held, and so on. But at that point, as I said, it's sort of solved. There's a rotation that's happening, and that rotation is leading to the interactions you're seeing. And of course, there is very little possibility to do any of this without any risk. Every time I go for a kick, I might be held depending on my opponent's mindset. Every time I go for the shoulder throw, I might get kicked out of it and then find myself too close to do anything else that I want to do. And every time I decide, nope, probably better not to kick now because I'll get caught like that, I might just have my opponent rush up to me and hit me. But regardless of what you are doing, it's important to bear in mind why it's happening the way it's happening. Aha, that doesn't work. So now that I've basically explained all that, you can watch for the thing in question happening. Rushdown is stopped by max range kicks. For example, had I kicked there, I would have had an advantage. Retreats that are watching for the kicks, only the ones that are watching for kicks, mind you, will be caught by that. And the kicks themselves are obviously defeated by holds. It is this sort of thing that particularly repetitive players will do against new players. You're not seeing the new player outcome happening here, because what the advanced player does, if they just want to beat you and don't have any interest in you bettering yourself much, or have a particular perspective on what bettering yourself means, they'll just loop the same thing over and over because that's the one you're not stopping. In my case, if you notice I'm looping the kicks over and over, it's because I like kicking things. That's the primary reason that's happening. And you cannot generally be absolutely sure whether or not your opponent is doing the thing they're doing because they really like to do it or not. But there are ways, once you've gotten used to fighting games, to tell, simply because if you leave them alone for long enough or don't stress them in any way, that's what they'll go back to as their default. It's the thing they do more when they realize they're winning, for example. And you can push on them and stress them out in various ways as a result of it. So yeah, I'm always going to want to kick things. And my opponent knows this and can make use of it in certain ways. But I am also aware that I can't just kick things forever. I have to get my opponent to be thinking about me kicking things before I can move to anything else. But similarly, if I do that wrong, that happens. And that was misspacing, for example. As was that. On Sun's side, not mine. So the question is, what should happen right here? My opponent's right next to me. And 3 different interactions happened there really quickly. I didn't fear the pressure because I had lots of health still. My opponent probably knew I didn't fear the pressure, and therefore didn't actually use it. Waited for me to do the thing that I do when I don't fear pressure, blah blah blah. It's a very long process. You notice that there is, however, a different way Ayane can beat some of Kasumi's kicks, but not all of them, and that's the main reason why that's just not the standard method. The kick you just saw me use, the running double kick, is explicitly for that situation. So my thought is not, I have to stop kicking things. There's more kicks I can use. And that, for example, was similarly a big bet, as was that. I'm just guessing now. Because once you've gotten to that point of the interactions where they're happening that fast, and you know that your opponent is also adapting that fast, conditioning isn't quite the thing that you're dealing with. Of course, the game does become, at least to me, somewhat fun at that point. There are definitely other players out there who find that to be the opposite of fun, but they tend to play different types of game. A game where nearly every attack can be stopped in some way, as long as you more or less guess right, which is basically what DOA is. Isn't always appealing to the sort of person who wants to work out tactically how to lab their way through situations. Unfortunately for those people, I feel like there's less and less of those games now where you can force a situation 100% guaranteed, just use enough meter or use a correct spacing and you just get to have this situation happen. Your opponent has ways out of it, but none that hurt you. Even Under Night is a little bit in that direction right now. And we got more defensive options in Melty Blood, so yeah. They might be able to get something out of DNF, we're not sure yet. But I did see a bunch of stuff from Ghostblade that made me think, oh, this character can actually set things up that you can't do anything about. The problem is that DNF is a little bit too, oddly, considering what the game is like, it's too honest for this to be a great thing, or rather a great idea. There are definitely characters that can always force a situation, but because the game has that weird meter, well, I wouldn't even call it weird, I shouldn't. Because the game has MP, they can't keep it up forever, so the flow is very different. You are able to, whenever you have MP, do this specific thing. You do get a guaranteed situation if your MP is up, but when it's not, it's basically like one of the few games that outright signals to the opponent what your options are. Because even though this is true in games with meter, normally because of the way those games flow, you don't start with the meter. Games that expect you to start with meter are very, very different and can be really frustrating to specific types of players. If you are starting with the meter, the game expects you to have every single option available to you from moment one. And that means there is no need to give the characters strong enough normal moves without the meter, without the MP. They can literally go, nope, as long as you are playing this game at all, we're going to assume that you have this option. If you don't have this option, it's because you used your MP on something else, and now it is valid for your opponent to know your status. And that means that their neutral moves can be a lot weaker. They can still cover tons of space, but strictly speaking, they're usually still weaker. In effect, it's just literally giving you a way on the screen to see not necessarily your opponent's mindset, but their restrictions. And the only reason this isn't the same way in nearly every other game is because of what I just mentioned. You don't have moves that the meter is required for to the point where you just can't do anything without it. Well, it was just us, and though I did have a lot to talk about, this is probably the last on-stream match, and probably the close of the lobby as well. Which is pretty much not an issue, given that we are the only ones in it. We're currently working on our robot bot improvement from the robotics lab that was shown on Friday. And we're still planning to have Absolver content tomorrow, although we are definitely still planning to switch to DNF stuff as soon as that game is available. When that bot is available, you will be able to find it on 2-mk.org, along with all of our other bots. I don't think we even have a KOF bot section yet, but we might have released Athena. I keep on forgetting to check this between streams. Information on if we are streaming or not streaming can be found at our Twitter 2_MK_FGC. And that will also be letting you know if we're having tonight's DOA Lounge, which would be the NA version of the same thing at 7:30 Eastern. Scent flying. If you are in the Northeast United States, watch out, heat advisory and all that. Chances are you're not getting this information from me, certainly not on an EU stream, but you know, anything to save a life and whatever else. And with that, brings us to the end of our stream entirely. This has been Rillian 14 2MK. Good luck with your training and good night, everyone.